the Remain, as in do you want to remain in the EU, was behind in the polls from the start. And as I say, we had spent many years either attacking the EU or, if not directly attacking, then saying actually there were many faults with the EU. And even in the heart of the Remain campaign, in the debates leading up to the 23rd of June, politicians on the Remain side still always felt compelled to admit that yes, there are many problems with the EU. There was then a but aren't we better off staying with them for X reason or for Y reason? I think we hadn't been clear about the benefits of being in the EU, nor clear actually about understanding why the EU was so important to many of our continental neighbours, and of course the history that had brought it about. And one of the other things that's become very clear is that because I think of the changing role of members of Parliament, and you're right, I've only been a member of Parliament since 2010, but I've been involved in the Conservative Party since 1989, that actually that ability for members of Parliament to build up links with other European parties, with European counterparts, with European capitals, really fell very much by the wayside. We are given as members of Parliament money by IPSA, the Parliamentary Standards Authority. We are allowed to spend money on travelling to the EU, but I honestly don't know how many of my colleagues actually did that. I certainly didn't do it as a backbench member of Parliament. There were those in my party who had built up links through things like the Konrad Adenauer Institute and others over the years, but I think they were few and far between. And at that moment, when we needed to be out there making a strong and emotional case for remaining in the EU, that case wasn't made. Now, of course, it was a simple question to ask. Do you want to leave or do you want to remain? But of course, it's going to prove much, much harder to deliver. And I think people are just beginning to understand all of that now, over 5 months after the referendum date. But I think there's also a wider issue in our politics. And I think the 3 points that were up there, I'll come on to this in a moment about why people voted to leave, are right. But there were many different reasons why people voted to leave. And as somebody who was both on a national level, setting out the campaign stall for Remain, but also on a local level, going out in my Midlands constituency on Saturdays, being the recipient of the many emails from people on both sides of the debate, including members of my own local party, I can tell you there were lots of different reasons why people chose to go in and to vote leave, often making their minds up at a very, very late stage. So literally sometimes as people were walking to the polling booth and they were remembering, oh, you know what, I've had enough of that Jean-Claude Juncker, that silly statement he made in the newspaper today, I'm going to vote to leave. Well, others, of course, and I was at university with Dan Hannan and Mark Reckless and Jacob Rees-Mogg and others, I should add, people like Damon Hines and Nigel Huddleston, but those, you know, Dan and Mark and others had spent many, many years working to prepare for the Leave campaign. And I think that politicians had sometimes, and we still do this, we promise that there are simple answers to very complex issues. And immigration is one of those answers. And I fully support what my colleague Anna Soubry has said in the Times today. We appeared to say to people that it will all be fine, that immigration, yes, if you feel uncomfortable the way your communities have changed, it will all be fine if we get the numbers down. But I think any of us know, if we live outside London, and London is a different city, be in no doubt that the way people think about immigration or diversity or just life actually in London is completely different wherever you go outside. And I can tell you 100 miles away from London, and again in my Midlands constituency, life feels very, very different. If you travel further north to a place like South Yorkshire, where I think the Labour Party is under real threat now from UKIP, life feels very, very different again. And I think that in terms of immigration and that policy, we had not made the case for not just about talking about immigration, but also talking about integration. And I was a candidate in Loughborough in 2005, and that was the election in which Michael Howard, one of the things that he wanted to make a key part of the Conservative Party manifesto was immigration. But if you remember, it was deemed to be racist or xenophobic to talk about immigration. And I remember when I first became a Member of Parliament, constituents would say to me, I'm not a racist, but, and they would set out their concerns. They felt they had to phrase it. I've noticed in the last year that first part of the sentence has gone. People now feel absolutely liberated to say what they think about changing communities and about immigration. Now, that's not always positive, but I do believe that if the political establishment tells people they can't talk about something, it will pop up in an even more nasty way and affect our politics, and it can take at least a decade to do so, and I think that we're reaping the benefit, or the tailwind, I should say, of that now. Now, the other issue, of course, was some of the statistics, and I know Matthew spoke earlier on. I wasn't here, sadly, to hear him, but things like, obviously, the issue of Turkey potentially joining the EU, the £350 million for the NHS. I mean, that number was believed by voters, not all of them, but many of them, who felt that was justification enough to vote to leave. And, of course, we've seen some of the Brexiteers, even in the last few days, talking about if we leave, there's money that's going to be going spare in the British economy, and we can use that to spend on our public services. But the other message that they had, and again, I suspect Matthew touched on this, was this take control back message. When I go and talk to schools in my constituency or elsewhere about politicians, and they talk about politicians not being very popular, which is true, and I say to them, when the House of Commons burnt down in the 1830s, the London population stood on the opposite bank of the Thames and they cheered. So politicians have never been very popular. And the British public don't like being told what to do, whether it's by members of parliament, whether it's by ministers, whether it's by MEPs, or whether it's by the Europeans. And I think what's really interesting is I was talking to a Polish gentleman in my constituency the other week. He's lived in the UK all his life, but his family come from Poland. He identifies, he's part of the Polish community in Loughborough. He's been secretary of the Polish club. And he said to me that he had voted to leave because he remembered what his family had told him about life under communism and being bossed around, and they didn't want that to happen with the EU telling us what we should be doing in our country. So I say the reasons for voting to leave were many and various. Another constituent said to me, life was much better before we joined the EU. Well, really? I'm not sure that many people would have agreed with that. I don't remember the 1970s Britain being held up as a beacon of where everybody else in the world wanted to head to. But of course, it's very easy for people to forget what life was really like and to project forward. And I also agree with the statements that on as I came in about the feeling left behind. The education, the fact that our education system had not prepared people for the changing world of work, and we can have a whole different debate about whether the education system is heading in the right direction now. Unsurprisingly, I would tell you that it absolutely is. But there's no doubt there are people who felt very strongly that the job they thought they were going to have for life has gone, often gone abroad, or, of course, been replaced by technology. And I know there are also people, again, constituents, who feel very firmly that 20 or 30 years ago, they would advise their son or their daughter to do what I've done. You know, you can have a nice life. You'll be able to afford the things that you want, to look after your family, to buy your own home. That has now changed. And I don't think the political establishment helped prepare the ground for that as well. So people did feel left behind or very left out. I think the other useful lesson, and I think perhaps is the lesson that we mistakenly drew from the 2015 election, is that the economy did not trump everything else. If you remember, the Remain camp was very, very focused on the economy, the economic hit that was going to be suffered if we voted to leave. And interestingly, I found that, A, we played that card very early, and B, it was factored in and then almost dismissed by some people. Now, for some people, particularly I would say the younger generation, who were and rightly are concerned about their jobs and their future prospects, the economy was very, very important. But as I say, for a lot of people, a lot of older people, actually that take control back absolutely trumped any economic impact. And that may be because they've seen recessions in the past and they know that actually whatever happens, we do somehow come out the other side, and we are an innovative and creative nation. I think we also missed on the Remain side a positive emotional connection. One of the things that I spent time doing, and we just got it published, but unfortunately it was on the same day as the awful tragic murder of Jo Cox, so it didn't get the coverage, was Women for Remain, and that was about 20 or so ministers, Conservative ministers in the government, setting out their reasons for Remain. We had a phenomenal press conference, and a couple of people came up afterwards and said, God, if we just had this sort of positivity, would that have affected the overall debate that we have had? And there was a lot of talk of where were the women's voices in the campaign. I mean, I don't think I can talk about the campaign without obviously talking about the Labour Party and the difficulties there in getting, I know individual Labour MPs, I work closely with people like Emma Reynolds, felt incredibly strongly, and Alan Johnson about the Remain camp, but actually getting the overall Labour message out there and Labour galvanised was incredibly difficult. And I also think that younger voters, one of the audiences I find hardest to address now are younger voters who ask me what's happened and what's going to happen to their generation. And I think that my first boss in politics, David Willits, in his brilliant book, The Pinch, identified one of the key divisions in this country now isn't just north and south or different communities, it's different age groups who see life incredibly differently, and we are going to have to work out a way of trying to unite that. So Nan's also asked me to talk about the process now for negotiations. I think the honest truth is that everybody is feeling their way, and that's one of the difficulties with this, is there's no obvious and easy answer. I firmly believe that the government should get on with triggering Article 50. We should have, and I said this in the House of Commons to David Davis recently, a very short bill, an Act of Parliament, which gives Parliament gives the approval to the government to trigger Article 50. Now, why do I say that as somebody who was a Remainer? Because until we have had that Act of Parliament passed, we cannot start talking about the terms on which we leave. Because every time people like me talk about the terms, we are accused of thwarting the will of the British people or trying to undermine the result of the referendum. And I think it is important that we have that vote, and then we can be able to debate the terms. I hope the Supreme Court has the final word in January. I think it would be incredibly bad for relations between Parliament and people if this were to proceed in some way to the European Court of Justice. We need a court resolution by the middle part of January, so we can get on with the legislation. And I think that Parliament should approve. Again, I have a number of emails from people who talk quite rightly about the fact that, well, actually, if you count in the whole electorate and the number of people who voted to leave, it's not the majority. Yes, I understand that. But we didn't, in the Referendum Act, put a threshold. We can debate whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing till the cows come home. People did want to have a say, and we do have a democratic vote. And I'll come on in a moment to talk about why we shouldn't destroy our constitution in the course of leaving. We also shouldn't undermine democratic votes in the course of leaving. I think we need an overall set of objectives from the government sooner rather than later. I've been looking at the white paper published before the Lisbon Treaty negotiations, and there are others as well. And that white paper is pretty detailed, and I understand the government's not wanting to put out there everything, but the point is that everything is going to be put out there when that letter is sent by the end of March to the EU, who will be, no doubt, briefing their own Parliament as well, who will then inevitably make these things public. Now, I heard before this debate about splits in the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party holding together. Let me be clear. I think that is going to be an issue, and it's an issue because many of us feel that there are members of our own party who have undermined leaders of the Conservative Party for many, many years on this EU issue. And people like me and Anna and others now want to give the Prime Minister space in which to negotiate and which to agree some inevitable compromises. And the trouble is that if we don't allow that space, if people are too ready to shout betrayal or that's not what I voted for and everything else, we will end up with the worst possible deal and combination for the UK in leaving the EU. I am opposed to a hard Brexit. I don't think we should get up and walk away, however tempting that might be at times. But it's going to be a massive undertaking. And I don't think anyone should underestimate quite how complex this is going to be. I'm a solicitor by profession, and just the reviewing of the EU legislation, 40 years worth of EU law, choosing which bits we want to keep, which bits we want to repeal, is a huge undertaking, and government lawyers in all departments are working absolutely frenetically on that. It's a huge impact on ministers, and it's going to be a huge impact on Whitehall. And I also don't think we should begrudge the recruiting of additional experts. I know that's not Michael Gove's chosen word, but additional experts in fields, additional civil servants. We need all the help and expertise and advice that we can get in delivering this. And I also think the government could be clearer about how big an undertaking this is, because it's going to impact on normal domestic politics in the sense that there isn't going to be the capacity to deliver the reforms that we might expect if a government weren't embarked on such a huge undertaking. That doesn't mean, of course, that other reforms aren't needed, and I'm mindful of the fact that in my former job, education, the 1944 Education Act happened while we were at war, engaged in the Second World War. There was a lot of thinking going on what post-wartime Britain would look like, and we need the thinking on what post-Brexit Britain looks like too. And we're already beginning to see the pressures building up on social care. That's going to be a huge domestic political issue. And, of course, things like prisons reform, which Liz Truss is rightly ploughing on with as well. I think there also needs to be a very clear tone of leadership from the top of government on the discussions. You know, it's not helpful to have attacks on members of parliament who are accused of thwarting the will of the people, the judges who are classified as enemies of the people, and then their independence is not defended, or on the Office of Budget Responsibility. It doesn't really do our democracy and our politics any favours if you're trying to galvanise everybody to work together. The complexities and the trade-offs need to be explained, and Parliament's going to have a key role in things like the Great Repeal Bill and, of course, in final treaty approval. And I do think that Parliament needs to be kept up to date on the latest negotiations. I remember when I was the EU Budget Minister being called before the EU Lords Committee and rightly scrutinised on what our tactics were going to be for negotiating that year's budget. And those are the sorts of scrutiny that needs to happen as we go through this process. And in relation to the devolved assemblies, well, of course, they need to have a formal level of involvement. There will be issues around legislative consent motions. We've got all this new English votes for English laws to think about the impact of that as well. And, of course, the return of powers. I was talking at the weekend about Northern Ireland, but, of course, we did have some devolution already to Northern Ireland before the 1972 European Communities Act. But, of course, since we have joined, we've now got a very different devolution settlement for Wales and for Scotland, and there are some powers that we return from the EU to their parliaments or assemblies rather than to Westminster. Very briefly, the outcome. Well, the Prime Minister has talked about, and I quote, deciding for ourselves how we control immigration, and another quote, give British companies the maximum freedom to trade with and to operate in the single market. Now, we need to be clear that the only question that was on the ballot paper was to leave or to remain. There was no question about how leaving would be achieved. And so I think it's absolutely legitimate for people to ask those questions now. I think Mark Carney is right to talk about transitional arrangements. The Prime Minister was right to talk about transitional arrangements at the CBI conference last week. And the speed with which Downing Street pulled back on that, I thought was extraordinary and probably doesn't reflect actually the discussions that are going on about transitional arrangements. We are clearly going to have a new immigration policy, a new controlled immigration policy. That has to be balanced, though, with a new integration policy. As I say, the two have got to go hand in hand. We've got to have a more grown-up 21st century immigration policy. We're going to have a new trade policy, including obviously exploring new markets, new free trade agreements, including a new FTA with the EU, which has to be a priority, and I suspect negotiated alongside the Article 50 exit process, and of course more push on exports. There has to be some form of participation in or access to the single market. And that's because we have, obviously, it's not just about goods, our economy, it's very much about services. I remember talking to a food exporting business in my constituency. They import the products, they turn them into sauces, they export them around the EU. And for them, actually, to be thinking about the markets they export, having to deal with a different set of regulations, would be incredibly complex. And I suspect could end up putting smaller companies like that out of business if they didn't have the legal ability to worry about across EU regulations. The customs union, again, I can't tell you. And I think one of the debates we had is, should people on my side of the argument and the opposition, should they be setting out what they think is the right deal? I would argue that actually that's why this government setting out their overall objectives is so important. And, of course, something they haven't really talked about is, of course, our future security relationship with the EU. Now, what does that look like? And one assumes that those security relationships will continue. But I can tell you that from my conversations on doorsteps, a lot of the reasons people voted to remain was as much about security and continuing cooperation as it was about the economic benefits. And, of course, that's thrown into ever sharper relief by the election of President Trump and his commitment or not to NATO. My conclusion is that in leaving, we must not fatally undermine our economy, our constitution, or our values as a country. The political establishment and the commentariat needs to grow up There are no simple solutions. There are only going to be some very hard choices, and they're going to take time to arrive at. We need to have the best and the brightest working on this on all sides of the debates. And while we do have a weak opposition, backbench MPs like me and backbench MPs on all sides have to step up to ensure that leaving does not mean disaster, but means a completely new, bright chapter for the United Kingdom. Thank you.